Hi class, today we will talk about social psychology. And here are the 5 parts we are going to learn. First, what is social psychology? Second, social influence, conformity and obedience. Think of an organization or group to which you have belonged. Have you ever just gone along with one of the group's idea, even though you knew it was a bad idea? Yes, I think all of us have done that. And that was called conformity. In the section of helping and harming others, we will talk about bystander intervention and prosocial abilities. In the fourth section, we will talk about how attitudes relate to behavior and common and effective persuasion techniques. In the fifth section, we will talk about some of the causes of prejudice and describe methods for combating it. Okay, great. First, what is social psychology? Social psychology is a tremendous amount of things, but ultimately is about how people function in the social domain, the effect of presence of others on our behavior, beliefs, and attitudes. Social psychology focuses on the power of the situation rather than dispositional forces driving behavior. By dispositional forces, we mean individual factors such as your personality, your IQ. So today we are going to focus on the power of the situation to influence human behavior. Social psychology is important for one key reason. We humans are highly social species. We have this biologically based need for interpersonal connections. Research shows that the threat of social isolation can lead us to behave in self-destructive ways and even impair our mental functioning. For example, in a series of experiments, researchers asked undergraduates to complete a personality measure and gave them bogus feedback based on their test results. They told some of the participants, "You are the type who will end up alone later in life," and others, "You are likely to be accident prone later in life." The students who received the feedback that they will be isolated toward the end of their lives were significantly more likely than those in the other group to engage in unhealthy behaviors like eating a snack or procrastinating on their assignment. The same negative feedback is so upsetting that it may even impair students' performance on IQ tests. So, increase in loneliness are tied to heightened rates of depression, early death, cognitive decline, risk for Alzheimer's disease. Although we're not really sure those are like a causal relationship, but they are definitely correlated with each other. So humans in general are social species. We live our lives in a social sphere where even our own abilities and beliefs are somewhat determined or dependent on other people. So this social comparison theory, developed by Festinger in the 1950s, explains how we evaluate our own abilities and beliefs. We compare them to the abilities and beliefs of other people. And this process of social comparison helps us understand ourselves and our social world. By comparing with other people, we get a sense of how we are doing. If you have siblings, you know exactly what it's like. You will always compare ourselves to our siblings in some way, trying to get how we are doing by seeing whether we are on track with, or better or worse than our sibling. But who we are comparing ourselves to? Well, if we are making upward social comparison, We compare ourselves to people who are doing better than us in some way. But if we are comparing ourselves to people who are doing worse than we are making downward social comparisons. So we may compare ourselves to classmates who didn't do as well on the exam and make some sort of assessment of our own skills and abilities. Despite who we are comparing ourselves to, social comparison can boost our self-concept. In terms of upward social comparison, we can sometimes feel like, if he did achieve that, I can do that too. But this is only when we are making upward social comparison with some people who are relatively similar to us. Also, when we engage in upward social comparison, we tend to overestimate that person's intelligence. We may conclude that, I'm not dumb, he's just incredibly smart. With downward social comparison, we can boost our self-esteem by feeling superior to people who are less competent than we are. Just as we often turn to others to better understand ourselves, we often look to them when a situation is ambiguous and we are not sure what to do. It's very natural and sometimes it's a pretty good idea. But what if others are irrational? Then we may do the same because social behavior is often contagious. When other people's behavior is irrational and we follow them, it's likely we will have mass hysteria, the outbreak of irrational behavior that is spread by social contagion, just follow other people. And this is a perfect time to talk about this phenomenon, like this crazy purchasing behavior of buying toilet papers. It's not really essential, it's not like food or medicine. But when we see other people buy them like crazy, we are really likely to follow the suit. So, social psychology is all about how behavior is influenced by the presence of other people. Under the right situation, the presence of others can make us perform better. And this is a phenomenon called social facilitation. For instance, in the first social psychology experiment ever performed, bicycle racers rode faster when they were competing alongside another bicyclist compared to when they are raced only against the clock. And this is exactly what social facilitation looks like. However, this social performance enhancing effect doesn't apply to all tasks. It applies to tasks that we are good at, tasks that are easy for us. Therefore, the presence of others doesn't always make us perform better. When the task is difficult, the presence of others can actually hurt our performance. So, for instance, for some people it might be public speaking. For others, it might be juggling. And this effect, where we choke in the presence of other people, is called social disruption. Because we are social creatures, and because we have rich mental experiences, we spend much of our lives trying to figure out why other people behave the way they do, and also trying to figure out why we do some of the things we do. But often, we make illogical inferences about other people's behavior. An illogical inference about the behavior of others is called a cognitive bias. We use this term attribution to describe different causes for behavior. We can make internal, dispositional attributions. We can also make external or situational attributions for other people's behavior. If we make internal, dispositional attribution for other people's behavior, it will be like, why he or she does that? It's because of their, personality. It's because their attitudes. Is it because of their beliefs, their intelligence? Something, personal about them. If we make external situational attributions, it will be it's because of the environment they are in, and that influence their behaviors. It's not something about themselves, but because of their environments. This leads us to the fundamental attribution error. According to fundamental attribution error, we are more likely to attribute other people's behavior to dispositional influences, such as their personality, their intelligence, their attitude, and we tend to underestimate the influence of situation on other people's behavior. For example, let's say we hear that so and so didn't do well on their exam. So we think, boy, they must not be very smart. We make a dispositional attribution, and we don't think about the fact that maybe this person didn't do so well because they were up all night helping a friend, or because they just went through a breakup. On the other hand, we do not show fundamental attribution error when we are making attributions for our own behaviors. Instead, we slightly more likely to attribute our own behavior to contextual factors, to situational factors, at least when the behavior might be negative. So let's say we get our test back and find out that we also didn't do so well. And we are going to conclude that we are stupid? Probably not. Chances are you are going to turn to external, situational explanations. You had, 2 other exams that same week, your professor didn't make the test fair, etc. So why do we engage in fundamental attribution error? Attribute other people's behavior to dispositional influences and attribute our own behavior to situational factors. There are a few possible reasons. For one, we have a better knowledge of what's going on in our own world than what is going on in other people's world. For example, we know when we are just having a bad day because of whatever is going on in our life. But we are less aware of how other people's situation might influencing them. Therefore, we are quicker to assume that their behavior is caused by something about them rather than their environment, because we don't really have much knowledge about their environment, their situations. Okay, so now we know just a little about how we understand our behavior and the behavior of other people. Let's talk a little bit about how others influence us. So, social influence is the process by which others influence our behavior. So, there are two sources of social influence: the influence of the general others and influence of leaders. So, conformity means peer influence, and obedience means leader influence. The difference between conformity and obedience is that conformity happens under no pressure. People change their behavior to match that of others, whereas obedience occurs as the result of pressure from an authority figure or a leader. Look at this standard line on the left. Which of the comparison lines on the right matches the standard line in length? It's obvious, right? It's the third, right? Not a difficult task. This line example is straight out of one of the most classic social psychology experiments of all time. In 1955, Ash conducted this study of conformity, during which he told people that they were going to be in a study of perceptual judgment. During the experiment, participants were in a group of people and they were to compare the standard line with the three comparison lines and choose which one was the same length as the comparison line. When the Confederates that said the third one matched the standard line, the participant was very likely to say so too. Confederates here means actors and people who are hired and paid by the researcher to conduct this research together. And please go and to watch these two short videos. It's definitely mind-blowing. It's so interesting and so funny. And please watch these two videos and then come back to our video. So, what were some of the social factors that influence how likely we are to conform to the group? In other words, what determines how likely we are, just to go with the group and choose the line that we know is not the right length? I will talk about three major social factors. The first is uniformity of agreement. Conformity is more likely when there is uniformity of agreement. When all the Confederates gave the same wrong answer, participants were more likely to conform. But if there were just one Confederate who gave the right answer, participants were 75% less likely to conform. So it just shows one single descendant can be quite powerful. The second factor is difference in wrong answer. If someone else also differed from the majority, for example, the majority chose A and that person chose C. Although that person doesn't, have the same choice as you, but because of the existence of that person, you are less likely to conform to the majority because someone else is also have a different opinion. The third factor is the size of the majority. It matters, but it only up to about 5 to 6 Confederates. Conformity is no different when there is 10 Confederates versus when there is 5 Confederates. So these three factors are situational factors that affect how other people, how other group members influence our behavior. In addition to these situational factors we just talked about, there are also individual and cultural differences in how likely we are to conform. The first is research shows that for people who have lower self-esteem, they are more likely to conform. And speaking of cultural differences, Asian people from collectivist cultures are more prone to conform than people from individualistic cultures. And interestingly, there is no significant gender differences. Men and women are equally likely to conform. Some of us may have the impression that women are more likely to conform, but research shows that this is not the case. One process that can make us more vulnerable to conformity is de-individuation. It is the tendency of people to engage in uncharacteristic behavior when they are stripped of their usual identities. The most prominent factors contributing to de-individuation are a feeling of being anonymous and a lack of personal responsibility. When we are de-individualized, we become more vulnerable to social influence. For example, once people start to post nasty comments on YouTube videos, others quickly pile on. And this is a phenomenon called online disinhibition effect. When we talk about this individuation, we must talk about Dr. Zamboto's Stanford prison study. And now please pause our video and go check this video. It's also one of the most classic psychology study. It's very fascinating. So, the college students in this experiment were assigned to either the roles of prisoner or guards in a mock prison. The guards eventually start to treat prisoners cruelly. They force them to do push-ups, they strip them naked, they force them to clean filthy toilets, placing bags over their heads. Look at these pictures. These are all pictures from the experiment. Remember, these people are all Stanford undergraduate students. So this study just shows that how quickly people can adopt the roles they are required to adopt. It also shows that when we are stripped of our own identities, what kind of behaviors we can conduct. This is definitely a classic study, but there are problems with this study. The prisoners and the guards may have experienced demand characteristics to behave in accord with their assigned roles. And also, at least one study failed to replicate the findings of this study. In addition, perhaps the participants in this Stanford prison study were not so average at all. So after this experiment, people measured the participants' personality, and they find that these participants are more aggressive, manipulative, and narcissistic than the average. So maybe this is a special group of participants, so the results cannot generalize to others. So these are the problems associated with the study, but even with all these problems, this is still a very interesting experiment, or in other words, a demonstration. And actually something very similar happened in our real life. This prison is in Iraq, and it becomes infamous in 2004 due to release of photos of US guards torturing prisoners, both physically and sexually torture, rape, murder. Dr. Zimbordo, the researcher we just talked about, who conducted the Stanford prison study, he argued that the guard lost themselves in social roles they were assigned to. They are assigned to be guards. They believe that they're supposed to behave like guards. So he argued that the line between good and evil is permeable, and almost anyone can be induced to cross it when pressed by situational forces. It just suggests again that situation is very powerful and is not easy for us to escape it. Closely related to the concept conformity is a phenomenon called groupthink. It means when you go along with your group at the expense of your own critical thinking. So how to solve this problem, groupthink? One good solution is to have devil's advocate. It's a person whose role is to voice doubts about the group's decisions. When a group of people almost reach a decision on something, that person, that devil's advocate, can say, okay, now let's take a step back. Let's take a look of the situation from a different perspective to see how it looks like. Just provide a unique, a different opinion than the group decisions. Another phenomenon related to groupthink is called group polarization. It's the tendency of the group discuss to strengthen beliefs held by individual group members. For example, before discussing with the group, you believe smoking is bad. And when you discuss with your group members, people say, oh, smoking is bad, smoking kills. And this group discussion just strengthened your previous belief. And now you believe that smoking is bad and should be banned. So group polarization means when a person shifts to an extreme opinion when in a group. So now we have learned about how other people can influence our behavior in situations where there is no real pressure for us to change our behavior. Let's move on to talk about situations in which there is pressure to change our behavior. Pressure from a leader or an authority to obey. So we said earlier that obedience occurs as the result of pressure from an authority figure or a leader. But is obedience necessarily a bad thing? Well, obedience is sometimes necessary for society to run smoothly. I tell you what you should do, and at the same time, there is someone who is telling me what I should do. We will have serious issues when there is obedience without questioning. Obey orders blindly. So, psychologist Stanley Milgram was interested in why the Holocaust occurred. How human beings can do such horrible things to other human beings. Was it a product of twisted mind or obedience? And actually, we have talked about this experiment in our previous chapters. I'm wondering if you guys still remember. But since this is also a very important experiment in the history of psychology, please watch the video again. So, to briefly summarize this experiment, participants were told that they were going to participate in a study looking at the effect of punishment on learning. They were given the role of teacher, and an actor and a confederate was given the role of learner. What the participant didn't know was that their supposed partner was actually a trained confederate. Although the participant was led to believe that they had an equal chance of being either the teacher or the confederate, the participant was always assigned to be the teacher, and the confederate was always assigned to be the learner. When the learner made a memory mistake, the experimenter ordered the participant to deliver painful electric shocks at increasingly stronger level. So the shock generator starts with a mild shock and increases to the moderate shock, and then in the end to the danger, severe shock, and then XXX shock. The results are shocking. All participants gave at least one shock. 62% of the participants gave the XXX shock, the most severe shock. Pretty much everyone underestimated the influence of context on obedience. Milgram found that a number of situational factors affected how obedient participants were. We will talk about the key theme among these factors, which is the psychological distance. First, let's talk about the psychological distance between the experimenter and the participant. As the psychological distance from the experimenter increases, this obedience decreases. Participants who were much more obedient when the experimenter was in the same room as the participant, compared to when the experimenter gave the participant instructions by the phone. So it means the further away the experimenter, the less obedient the participant become. Now let's talk about the psychological distance between the teacher and the learner. The teacher are the participants. So as the psychological distance between the teacher and the learner increases, obedience increases. So it means the further away you are from the learner, the more likely you are to give them electric shocks. The more close you are, sit close or psychologically close to the learner, the less likely you will give them electric shocks. Although obedient and disobedient participants were similar on most personality variables, there are few individual differences in how likely people are to obey. The first is morality. More moral people are less likely to obey. More moral people are more willing to break the rules compared to less moral people, particularly if the rules are perceived as not fair. The second personality trait is authoritarianism, a personality trait that is associated with having greater respect for and not questioning authority. More authoritarian is associated with greater tendency to obey authority figures, such as the experimenter in this study. And we find no gender difference. And also we find no cultural difference. So the question is, if this study were conducted today, what do you think the results will be? Do you think compared to half a century ago, people have become more obedient or less obedient? So let's conclude today's lecture by Zambordo's words. Heroes are those who can somehow resist the power of the situation and act out of noble motives, or behave in ways that do not demean others when they easily can. So in this class, we talk about what social psychology is. We talk about conformity and obedience. And in the next section, we'll talk about pro-social behavior and aggression, attitudes and persuasion, prejudice and discrimination.